Every morning, before the first rays of sunlight reached the rooftops of Willow Creek Lane, one house was already awake. The porch light glowed softly while the neighborhood still slept. Dew rested on perfectly trimmed grass, birds sang from maple branches, and the American flag slowly climbed its pole as the old man standing beneath it saluted with unwavering discipline. For 32 years, this ritual had never changed. His name was Daniel Carter. To passing neighbors, he was simply the quiet widower in the white brick house at the end of the street. His lawn was modest but immaculate. His porch held two wooden rocking chairs, one of which had remained empty ever since his wife Alina passed away 4 years earlier. A small flower garden bloomed beneath the windows, filled with the same roses Alina had planted decades before. Few people knew that Daniel had spent 24 years serving his country in the United States Marine Corps. Fewer still knew that his left knee carried permanent damage from an overseas deployment, or that the scars hidden beneath his sleeves came from a mission that had never appeared in newspapers. He never spoke about medals. He never displayed photographs from war. The only visible reminder of his service was the folded flag resting inside a glass case on the living room mantel, and another flag flying proudly outside every sunrise. For Daniel, patriotism was not a performance. It was a promise. Willow Creek Lane had once been a neighborhood where people looked after one another. Children played until sunset, neighbors borrowed tools without paperwork. Birthday cakes crossed driveways, elderly couples watched over each other's homes during vacations. Then everything changed. A new homeowners association had taken control after a wealthy property developer bought several empty lots nearby. The association promised modernization, increased property values, and community excellence. Those words sounded harmless. But rules soon replaced relationships. Letters replaced conversations. Warnings replaced kindness. People who had once waved from their porches now measured grass with rulers and reported each other over mailbox colors. The HOA president was Linda Prescott. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed authority alone created respect. Her clothing was always flawless, her clipboard always full, and her smile rarely reached her eyes. To Linda, neighborhoods were not communities. They were investments. Every home represented numbers on a spreadsheet. Every resident represented compliance. She believed perfection attracted wealth. Anything imperfect threatened the image she wanted to sell. Daniel's house became an irritation almost immediately. Not because it was neglected. Quite the opposite. It was older. Its charm came from decades of careful maintenance rather than expensive renovations. Its wooden porch had been repaired by Daniel's own hands countless times. Its flower beds honored memories instead of landscaping trends. Its flagpole stood taller than the decorative lights many newer residents preferred. Linda viewed the property as outdated. Daniel viewed it as home. Their worlds were destined to collide. The first letter arrived on a bright Monday morning. Daniel found it tucked neatly beneath his mailbox flag. The envelope carried the official HOA logo in bold blue print. Inside was a notice citing multiple alleged violations. The roses exceeded approved height. The porch swing required repainting. The mailbox style no longer matched community guidelines. The flagpole exceeded recommended dimensions. Failure to correct these issues within 14 days would result in escalating fines. Daniel read the page twice. Then folded it carefully. Then placed it inside a kitchen drawer. Not out of fear. Out of habit. Military service had taught him never to react before understanding the situation. The following afternoon, he attended the monthly HOA meeting held inside the community clubhouse. The room buzzed with polite conversations and forced smiles. Coffee cups lined folding tables. Presentation slides displayed charts predicting increased property values if stricter standards were enforced. Linda stood confidently before the audience, speaking about neighborhood excellence, market perception, and maintaining prestige. Daniel quietly waited until the presentation ended. He introduced himself with calm dignity. He explained that his roses had been planted by his late wife. He explained that the porch swing was built by his father nearly 50 years earlier. He explained that the flagpole had been installed after returning from military service and held deep personal significance. His words were respectful, measured, sincere. But emotion rarely changes people who have already made up their minds. Linda responded with professional politeness that carried no compassion. Rules existed for everyone. Exceptions weakened standards. Personal history could not override community regulations. Several residents nodded in agreement. Others avoided looking at Daniel altogether. No one wanted to challenge the HOA president publicly. Daniel thanked the board for their time. He left without raising his voice, without arguing, without demanding recognition. Outside, the evening breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass. He paused beside the clubhouse entrance and looked toward the flag flying over the nearby elementary school. For a long moment, memories flooded back. Friends who had never returned home. Families who had waited by front doors that never opened. Promises made beneath distant skies. He understood sacrifice. What he struggled to understand was why respect seemed harder to find in peace than it had been in war. Days passed. The fines began. $50. Then $100. Then $200. Each envelope listed new violations. The roses now attracted insects. The porch furniture appeared weathered. The American flag supposedly violated updated placement regulations due to its proximity to decorative lighting standards. Neighbors started whispering. Some sympathized privately. None spoke publicly. Fear is contagious in communities governed by penalties. One Saturday morning, Daniel was trimming hedges when 8-year-old Noah from across the street wandered over carrying a small toy airplane. The boy had always been fascinated by Daniel's stories of discipline, camping, and teamwork, though Daniel never discussed combat. Noah admired the flag. He asked why Daniel saluted it every day. Daniel smiled warmly and explained that the flag represented people rather than cloth. It represented sacrifice, freedom, responsibility. It reminded him of everyone who served together regardless of where they came from. Noah listened with the complete attention only children possess. Before leaving, the boy gave Daniel a handmade drawing. It showed an old soldier standing beside a flag with the words "Heroes live here" written in crooked crayon letters. Daniel thanked him. The drawing found a place beside Alina's favorite family photograph. Across the street, hidden behind carefully trimmed hedges, Linda observed everything from inside her SUV. She noticed the drawing. She noticed neighborhood children visiting Daniel. She noticed smiles replacing whispers. Influence concerned her almost as much as rule violations. Within days, another certified letter appeared. This one declared that unauthorized signs, artwork, or displays visible from windows violated aesthetic policies. The child's drawing was listed as a visual infraction. Daniel stared at the notice for several silent minutes. His hands trembled slightly. Not from age. Not from anger. From disbelief. Somewhere between regulations and appearances, humanity had disappeared. He removed nothing. Instead, he gently adjusted the drawing so it stood straighter beside Alina's photograph. The next week brought contractors hired by the HOA to inspect neighborhood compliance. They photographed Daniel's property from every angle. Measured his flower beds. Examined his porch. One worker quietly apologized before leaving. He admitted he was only following orders. Daniel nodded kindly. He understood that phrase better than most people ever would. Yet there was one difference. Real service protected people. Blind obedience often harmed them. As autumn slowly approached, golden leaves drifted across Willow Creek Lane. The neighborhood looked peaceful from the outside. Behind closed doors, however, resentment quietly grew. Residents began receiving increasingly aggressive notices over harmless issues. Garden decorations, holiday wreaths, wheelchair ramps, bird feeders. Families who once supported the HOA started questioning its priorities. Still, no one challenged Linda directly. Not yet. Daniel remained the easiest target. He paid none of the fines. Not because he couldn't. Because accepting them would mean admitting he had done something wrong. One crisp Friday afternoon, a large white envelope arrived by certified mail. Its contents were thicker than usual. More official. More intimidating. Daniel opened it slowly while sitting in Alina's old rocking chair. His expression never changed, but his eyes lingered on the final page. The HOA had voted to place a lien against his home if outstanding violations remained unresolved within 30 days. The house he had purchased after returning from military service. The house where he had raised his daughter. The house where Alina had taken her final breath. The house protected by decades of honest work and sacrifice. Someone now believed paperwork entitled them to take it away. Daniel carefully folded every page. He placed them beside the child's drawing on the mantel. Then he walked outside as sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and crimson. Without hesitation, he raised the American flag down for the evening exactly as he had done thousands of times before. His salute remained steady. His posture remained proud. But somewhere beyond the quiet street, unseen by everyone watching from behind curtains, forces were already beginning to move. Because while Willow Creek Lane believed it was dealing with nothing more than an elderly veteran refusing HOA rules, someone else had just learned exactly what was happening. And unlike Daniel, they had no intention of staying silent. Monday mornings usually arrived quietly on Willow Creek Lane, but this one carried a tension that seemed to settle over every rooftop. Daniel Carter followed his routine exactly as he always had. Before sunrise, he stepped onto the porch wearing his faded Marine Corps jacket despite the cool autumn air. The American flag rose steadily up the pole, catching the first golden rays of daylight as they spilled across the neighborhood. Daniel saluted, holding the gesture for several long seconds before lowering his hand. To anyone watching, nothing had changed. Inside, however, the certified notice resting on his kitchen table reminded him that everything had. The lien process had officially begun. The HOA had scheduled a hearing to determine whether legal action should move forward against his home. Daniel wasn't afraid. War had taught him that fear accomplished very little. But disappointment settled deeper than fear ever could. He had spent decades believing that home was the reward for sacrifice. Now strangers who had never known hardship were trying to reduce that home to a list of violations and unpaid fees. He brewed coffee, watered Alina's roses, and quietly prepared for another ordinary day. Across the neighborhood, however, whispers were beginning to spread. Noah had shown his parents the drawing he made for Daniel. His mother, Rachel Bennett, listened as her son explained why the veteran saluted the flag every morning and why the HOA wanted the drawing removed from the window. At first she assumed her son had misunderstood. Children often mixed imagination with reality. But after reading copies of Daniel's violation notices posted anonymously in a neighborhood social media group, she realized the truth was somehow even worse. The discussion exploded. Some residents defended the HOA. Rules were rules. Property values mattered. Standards had to be enforced. Others questioned how flowers planted by a deceased wife or a child's drawing could possibly threaten an entire neighborhood. The comments grew heated. Still, most people used anonymous profiles. Very few were willing to attach their real names. Linda Prescott monitored every discussion carefully. She viewed public disagreement as a management problem. The solution in her mind was stronger enforcement. At the next HOA board meeting, she proposed increasing penalties for repeat offenders. She argued that allowing one resident to ignore regulations would encourage others to do the same. Several board members hesitated. The amount of attention surrounding Daniel's case was becoming uncomfortable. One elderly board member quietly suggested offering mediation instead of escalating legal action. Linda dismissed the idea almost immediately. Compassion, she insisted, weakened consistency. Consistency maintained authority. The motion passed. Outside the clubhouse, one board member remained behind after the meeting. His name was Harold Simmons. A retired accountant in his 70s, Harold had joined the HOA board hopping to help improve the neighborhood. Instead, he increasingly found himself signing paperwork that troubled his conscience. That evening, Harold drove slowly past Daniel's home. He watched the old Marine repairing a loose section of fencing without assistance. Daniel moved carefully because of his injured knee, but every repair was precise. Nothing about the property suggested neglect. Everything reflected care. Harold returned home carrying a weight he could no longer ignore. The following afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived at Daniel's porch. She introduced herself as Emily Carter, Daniel's granddaughter. She lived nearly 4 hours away and worked as an investigative journalist. When Daniel had mentioned the HOA notices during one of their weekly phone calls, he intentionally minimized the situation. He never wanted family to worry. But public records told a different story. Emily had searched court filings. She discovered the pending lien, the mounting fines, the repeated violations, the legal notices. She was stunned. Standing on the porch where she had spent countless childhood summers, she struggled to understand how her grandfather had become the target of an organization that claimed to improve communities. She looked around. The flower beds remained beautiful. The porch swing still creaked gently in the breeze. The house radiated warmth despite its age. Nothing justified what she had read. Daniel welcomed her with quiet gratitude. He never complained, never criticized anyone. Instead, he spoke about Alina, about the memories attached to every corner of the property, about how neighborhoods used to feel different. Emily listened carefully. Years of investigative reporting had sharpened her instincts. She recognized something beyond a property dispute. This wasn't about landscaping. It was about power. That evening, she began reviewing every HOA document she could legally obtain. Financial reports, board meeting minutes, violation histories, election records. Patterns slowly emerged. Daniel wasn't the only target. Several elderly homeowners had received unusually high fines over minor issues. Widows living alone, disabled residents, retired couples on fixed incomes. The violations often involved homes located near properties developers had expressed interest in purchasing. Emily's notebook filled with names, dates, addresses, questions. Coincidence became increasingly difficult to believe. Meanwhile, Linda continued preparing for the upcoming enforcement hearing. She viewed Emily's arrival with suspicion almost immediately. When she learned Emily worked in journalism, she quietly instructed the HOA attorney to ensure every procedure followed official policy. Appearances mattered. Documentation mattered. Public reception mattered. The truth mattered far less than controlling the narrative. 2 days later, Daniel attended a local veterans breakfast held every Thursday at a small diner outside town. The group met regularly, sharing coffee, memories, and quiet companionship. No uniforms. No speeches. Just veterans supporting one another. Daniel mentioned the HOA only briefly. He wasn't asking for help. He simply explained why he might not attend future breakfasts if legal expenses increased. The room fell silent. Several men exchanged concerned glances. One veteran, a former Navy chief named Robert Hayes, asked to see the notices. Daniel reluctantly handed them over. Robert read every page carefully, then passed them around the table. Expressions changed from curiosity to disbelief. One veteran quietly shook his head. Another folded his arms tightly across his chest. By the end of breakfast, no grand speeches had been made. No dramatic promises offered. But every man at that table left carrying copies of the documents. Service had taught them many lessons. One of them was never abandoning one of their own. Back in Willow Creek Lane, neighborhood attitudes were beginning to shift. Families who had once avoided Daniel now stopped to wave. Children still visited the porch. Some residents quietly delivered homemade meals. Others offered help with yard work. Daniel thanked each person sincerely but continued maintaining the property himself whenever possible. Pride, after all, was not arrogance. It was dignity. Linda noticed these changes immediately. Support threatened authority. She responded by issuing fresh violation notices to several additional homeowners. Holiday decorations exceeded seasonal guidelines. Garden benches lacked approval. Driveway stains required professional cleaning. Instead of silencing criticism, the new letters created even greater resentment. People began comparing notices. Patterns emerged. Neighbors who had barely spoken in months gathered on sidewalks discussing identical experiences. The HOA had unintentionally united the community against itself. Emily continued digging deeper. One evening, she visited the county records office. Buried among public filings, she discovered something surprising. Several homes previously forced into foreclosure over HOA liens had later been purchased by companies connected to the same development group that had originally supported Linda Prescott's election. The transactions weren't necessarily illegal, but they raised serious ethical questions, especially considering how aggressively vulnerable homeowners had been targeted beforehand. Emily sensed there was a larger story waiting beneath the paperwork, one worth exposing. As the hearing date approached, media interest slowly began growing. Not national attention. Not yet. A small local newspaper contacted Emily after hearing rumors of a veteran facing foreclosure over landscaping violations. The reporter requested an interview. Daniel politely declined. He had never sought publicity. Emily respected his wishes. Instead, she shared public documents and encouraged the newspaper to investigate the HOA itself rather than focusing solely on one homeowner. The first article appeared that Saturday. Its headline asked a simple question: when do community rules become community harm? The story spread quickly online. Comments poured in from readers across the state. Many shared nearly identical experiences involving different HOAs. Others expressed outrage over Daniel's treatment despite never having met him. Linda dismissed the article publicly. She described it as emotional journalism lacking complete context. Privately, however, she grew increasingly concerned. Attention was becoming dangerous, especially if someone looked closely enough. Sunday afternoon arrived with unusually heavy clouds. Daniel sat quietly on the porch polishing the wooden frame around Alina's favorite photograph. Across the street, Noah waved enthusiastically before riding his bicycle over. This time he wasn't alone. Half a dozen neighborhood children followed behind carrying paper flags they had made during a school project. Without saying much, they planted the small flags carefully along the edge of Daniel's flower garden. Not as protest. Not as politics. Simply as gratitude. Parents watched from nearby sidewalks. Some smiled. Some wiped away tears. Even residents who had once supported the HOA found themselves moved by the quiet display. Daniel looked across the tiny sea of paper flags fluttering beside Alina's roses. For the first time in weeks, hope stirred gently inside him. He realized something important. Authority could demand obedience, but respect had to be earned. Unfortunately for Linda Prescott, she had mistaken one for the other. As evening settled over Willow Creek Lane, Emily received an anonymous envelope slipped beneath her motel room door. Inside were photocopies of confidential HOA financial records. Attached to the top page was a handwritten note containing only 7 words. "You're looking in the right direction, keep digging." Emily stared at the documents for a long time. Someone inside the HOA had decided to come forward. And if these records proved authentic, the battle over Daniel's home was about to become something far bigger than anyone had imagined. The anonymous envelope remained on Emily Carter's desk long after midnight. Outside her motel window, the town was quiet. Streetlights reflected off empty sidewalks and the occasional passing car disappeared into the darkness. But inside the small room, page after page of financial records painted a picture that refused to let her sleep. Emily had spent years investigating corruption, fraud, and abuse of power. She had learned that important stories rarely began with dramatic revelations. They began with small inconsistencies, numbers that didn't match, signatures that appeared too often, payments that seemed ordinary until viewed together. This case was no different. The HOA's financial statements listed legal expenses far higher than neighboring associations of similar size. Several consulting contracts had been awarded without competitive bids. Maintenance funds had been redirected toward administrative costs. Most concerning of all, companies receiving HOA contracts shared business addresses with firms connected to the same real estate investors who had supported Linda Prescott's rise to HOA president. Individually, none of the documents proved wrongdoing. Together, they revealed a pattern. A pattern that deserved answers. Emily refused to rush. She understood that accusations without evidence only weaken the truth. Every record had to be verified. Every signature authenticated. Every transaction confirmed through public records. For the next several days, she worked from sunrise until late evening. County offices, tax records, property transfers, corporate registrations, meeting minutes. The puzzle slowly came together. Meanwhile, Daniel continued living exactly as he always had. Every morning, he raised the American flag. Every afternoon, he tended Aliner's roses. Every evening, he sat quietly on the porch, watching the sunset paint Willow Creek Lane in shades of gold and crimson. His peace unsettled Linda more than anger ever could. She expected resistance, arguments, public outbursts. Instead, Daniel remained dignified, calm, unshaken. His quiet strength was becoming more persuasive than any speech. The hearing date was now only 1 week away. Linda believed victory was inevitable. The unpaid fines had reached nearly $18,000 after months of accumulated penalties, legal fees, inspections, and administrative charges. The lien process was nearly complete. Soon, she believed, Daniel would have no choice but to comply or lose the home. She failed to notice how much had changed around her. Residents who once greeted her warmly now offered only polite nods. Attendance at HOA meetings had doubled. Questions were becoming more direct. Financial transparency was suddenly everyone's concern. The atmosphere she once controlled had begun slipping away. One Tuesday afternoon, Harold Simmons knocked on Daniel's front door. The retired accountant carried a weathered leather folder under his arm. His expression reflected weeks of internal conflict. For years, Harold had believed serving on the HOA board meant protecting the neighborhood. Instead, he realized he had unknowingly helped protect something very different. Inside the folder were copies of internal emails, voting records, budget revisions, board correspondence. Nothing had been stolen. Everything had been legally accessible to board members. Harold had simply decided his responsibility to the truth outweighed his loyalty to an organization that had lost its moral compass. He handed the folder to Emily, then quietly resigned from the HOA board that same afternoon. His resignation letter spread quickly through the neighborhood. It contained only a single sentence. Communities survive on trust, not intimidation. The words traveled farther than anyone expected. Within 48 hours, 2 additional board members resigned. Neither publicly accused Linda of misconduct, but neither defended her actions. The board was beginning to fracture. News of the controversy reached the Regional Veterans Association. Daniel never contacted them. Someone from the breakfast group had quietly shared his story. Soon, veterans from neighboring counties began visiting Willow Creek Lane. Not to protest, not to intimidate, simply to support one of their own. They parked respectfully along the street, shared coffee on Daniel's porch, helped repaint the aging fence, repaired loose gutters, trimmed hedges. Every act of kindness complied completely with HOA regulations. Ironically, Daniel's property had never looked better. Neighbors noticed. Children noticed. Even passing drivers slowed down. The house that had once stood alone had become a symbol of something much larger than one veteran's struggle. Linda interpreted every gathering as a challenge to her authority. She instructed the HOA attorney to accelerate legal proceedings. The hearing would move forward exactly as scheduled. No delays. No negotiations. No compromise. Authority, she believed, could not afford hesitation. Emily continued assembling evidence. The breakthrough arrived unexpectedly. One property transfer from nearly 3 years earlier caught her attention. An elderly widow had accumulated HOA fines totaling just over $12,000. Unable to pay, she lost her home. 3 months later, the property sold well below market value to a limited liability company. 6 months after that, the home was resold at nearly double the price following cosmetic renovations. The LLC traced back to investors connected with one of Linda's consulting firms. Emily checked another case. Then another. Then another. The same pattern repeated itself. Not dozens of times, but enough. Enough to establish that vulnerable homeowners had consistently become targets shortly before their properties entered foreclosure. The violations themselves were technically legitimate. The enforcement, however, appeared highly selective. Power had been exercised not equally, but strategically. Emily contacted an attorney specializing in HOA law. After reviewing the documentation, the attorney offered only one observation. If this evidence is accurate, the issue isn't landscaping. It's abuse of authority. Word of the upcoming hearing spread beyond the neighborhood. Local television stations requested access. Newspapers assigned reporters. Community advocacy groups announced they would attend. The HOA meeting room, usually half empty, suddenly required additional seating. Linda assured everyone she welcomed transparency. Privately, she instructed staff to limit public comments. Control remained her highest priority. On the evening before the hearing, Daniel visited Aliner's grave. The cemetery rested peacefully beneath towering oak trees shedding autumn leaves. He cleaned the headstone carefully, placed fresh roses beside it, then sat quietly for nearly an hour. He thought about their first apartment, their daughter's childhood, the countless sacrifices military life had demanded. Every deployment, every homecoming, every promise they had made to build a peaceful future together. He realized that losing the house would never erase those memories. Home existed in people before it existed in walls. Still, some places became sacred because love had lived there. Those places deserved protecting. As Daniel stood to leave, he noticed another bouquet already resting beside Aliner's grave. No card. No name. Only a small ribbon tied around the flowers. Written on the ribbon were 4 simple words. Your service mattered, always. Daniel smiled quietly. Sometimes gratitude arrived from unexpected places. The next morning, Willow Creek Lane awakened earlier than usual. News vans parked near the entrance. Residents gathered outside their homes. Veterans wearing service caps stood respectfully along the sidewalks. Children carried handmade flags. No chants. No signs. No shouting. Only quiet support. Linda arrived at the clubhouse precisely on schedule. She stepped from her vehicle expecting confidence to return once the meeting began. Instead, she found cameras waiting. Reporters requesting comments. Residents asking difficult questions. For the first time since becoming HOA president, she looked uncertain. Inside the meeting room, every chair filled quickly. Late arrivals stood against the walls. The atmosphere felt less like an HOA hearing and more like a community searching for its conscience. Daniel entered quietly. No applause greeted him. He would not have wanted it. Instead, people simply stood. One by one. Silently. Veterans. Parents. Teenagers. Retirees. Even residents who had once supported the HOA rose to their feet. The gesture lasted only a few moments. No one had planned it. No one had organized it. Respect simply found its own language. Daniel nodded humbly before taking his seat. Linda called the meeting to order. Her voice remained steady. Barely. Emily sat several rows back with neatly organized binders containing months of research. Verified financial records. Property histories. Internal emails. Witness statements. Board correspondence. Everything had been indexed, authenticated, and cross-referenced. She wasn't interested in embarrassing anyone. She wanted facts to speak for themselves. As the hearing officially began, Linda presented the HOA's case. Repeated violations. Unpaid fines. Failure to comply. Administrative procedures. Legal authority. Every sentence followed protocol. Everything appeared perfectly organized. Until the board opened the floor for documented evidence from the homeowner. Emily slowly stood. She carried one binder to the front table. Then another. Then another. By the time she finished, 6 thick binders rested before the board. The room fell completely silent. Even Linda stared at the growing stack with visible concern. Emily opened the first binder. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Methodically. Like someone who already knew the truth no longer needed convincing. The first page contained verified financial records. The second listed selective enforcement statistics. The third documented property transfers connected to repeated foreclosure cases. Behind those pages waited hundreds more. Every one supported by public records. Every one legally obtained. Every one impossible to dismiss with a simple explanation. For the first time since Daniel received his very first violation notice, the people who believed they held all the power realized they might soon be the ones answering questions. Silence settled over the HOA meeting room like a heavy blanket. The 6 binders resting on the table seemed ordinary from a distance, but everyone present understood they carried something far more significant than paperwork. They carried months of verified records, public filings, financial statements, internal correspondence, and documented patterns that no one in the room had expected to see. Emily Carter remained calm. She had no interest in dramatic accusations or emotional speeches. The evidence would speak louder than anger ever could. Page by page, she presented a timeline that stretched back several years. Every document had been verified through county records. Every financial statement matched official filings. Every property transfer had been confirmed. Every email had been authenticated. The picture that emerged was deeply troubling. The HOA had repeatedly imposed extraordinary fines on homeowners who shared one common characteristic. They were vulnerable. Retired couples living on fixed incomes. Widows living alone. Disabled residents. Military veterans. Homeowners without the financial resources to challenge lengthy legal proceedings. In case after case, relatively minor violations had escalated into thousands of dollars in penalties. Some owners eventually sold their homes under pressure. Others lost them through foreclosure. Several properties were later purchased by investment companies connected through overlapping business relationships. No single document proved criminal intent. Together, however, they revealed a disturbing pattern of selective enforcement that demanded independent investigation. The room remained completely still. Residents who had once defended the HOA quietly exchanged uneasy glances. Even those who had supported strict neighborhood standards had never imagined the rules might be applied so unevenly. Linda Prescott attempted to interrupt several times, insisting the documents lacked context. But every time she questioned a record, Emily calmly produced another supporting document. Another county filing. Another financial report. Another signed meeting minute. Facts have a remarkable quality. They become difficult to argue with when they are carefully organized. One board member slowly removed his reading glasses. Another leaned back in complete disbelief. The HOA attorney quietly requested a short recess. The board agreed immediately. For the first time since Daniel's ordeal had begun, the people sitting behind the long conference table no longer appeared confident. Outside the clubhouse, reporters hurried to relay updates. Television cameras captured residents discussing what they had just witnessed. Veterans stood quietly together beneath the autumn trees. No one celebrated. This had never been about defeating someone. It had always been about defending what was right. Inside the private boardroom, voices rose behind closed doors. Several remaining board members demanded explanations from Linda. Questions that had once been dismissed suddenly became impossible to ignore. Why had enforcement focused so heavily on certain homeowners? Why had financial oversight been so limited? Why had legal expenses increased so dramatically? Why had board members received incomplete reports? Linda insisted every action had followed HOA bylaws. Technically, many had. But legality and integrity are not always the same. After nearly 40 minutes, the board returned. Their expressions had changed. The acting vice president stood instead of Linda. His hands trembled slightly as he addressed the room. Effective immediately, all enforcement actions against Daniel Carter were suspended. Every outstanding fine would be frozen pending an independent audit. The proposed lien against his home was withdrawn. The audience remained silent for several seconds before quiet applause gradually filled the room. Daniel simply lowered his head. Relief appeared in his eyes, but not triumph. He had never wanted victory over anyone. He had only wanted fairness. The vice president continued. The board voted unanimously to request an outside investigation into HOA financial practices and enforcement procedures. Linda Prescott was placed on administrative leave until the review concluded. Gasps spread across the room. Linda remained seated. For the first time since becoming HOA president, she had no authority left to exercise. Power that had once seemed permanent disappeared in a single afternoon. Weeks passed. Independent auditors arrived. Attorneys reviewed years of financial records. County officials examined foreclosure cases. State regulators requested additional documentation. What had begun as one veteran refusing unfair fines became an investigation reaching far beyond Willow Creek Lane. The final audit took nearly 3 months to complete. Its conclusions shocked even longtime residents. Although investigators found no evidence of widespread criminal conspiracy, they documented serious ethical failures, selective enforcement practices, conflicts of interest, poor financial oversight, and repeated violations of governance standards. The report recommended sweeping reforms. Several board members resigned permanently. New elections were ordered. Financial transparency requirements became mandatory. Violation appeal procedures were completely rewritten. Homeowners would now have access to independent mediation before significant penalties could be imposed. Most importantly, enforcement policies would apply equally to every resident. No exceptions. No favorites. No convenient targets. Linda Prescott resigned before disciplinary proceedings concluded. Her consulting contracts quietly disappeared. The influence she had spent years building vanished almost overnight. Ironically, she experienced something she had rarely offered others. Consequences. Not because anyone sought revenge. Because accountability eventually reaches everyone. Daniel received an official letter from the newly elected HOA board. Every fine against him had been permanently canceled. The HOA formally apologized for the treatment he had endured. Legal expenses were reimbursed. The lien filing was removed from county records. The board also requested permission to restore several features they had once demanded he remove. Daniel accepted the apology. Not because forgetting was easy, but because bitterness would only prolong the pain. Forgiveness, he believed, was not excusing wrongdoing. It was refusing to let wrongdoing define the future. Winter gradually gave way to spring. Eleanor's roses bloomed once again. Children continued visiting Daniel after school. Noah, now slightly taller and noticeably more confident, often helped water the garden. The faded drawing that had once been labeled an HOA violation still rested proudly beside Eleanor's photograph. Only now no one questioned it. One Saturday morning, the newly elected HOA board organized something the neighborhood had never done before. A community appreciation day. Instead of discussing violations, residents planted trees together. Families shared homemade food. Children played games across the park. Neighbors who had barely spoken in years introduced themselves again. The event ended beside Daniel's home. The board unveiled a small bronze plaque installed near the sidewalk. It read, "This home reminds us that communities are measured not by perfection, but by how they treat those who have already sacrificed for others." Daniel looked at the plaque for a long moment, then quietly shook his head. He thanked everyone for the gesture but reminded them that countless veterans lived quietly across the country without recognition. If the neighborhood truly wished to honor service, they should notice the people around them every day, not only after a public controversy. His words stayed with everyone present. Months later, Willow Creek Lane looked remarkably similar to how it always had. The same houses. The same sidewalks. The same maple trees. Yet everything felt different. People greeted one another again. Neighbors helped elderly residents with yard work. HOA meetings focused less on punishment and more on cooperation. The neighborhood had rediscovered something it had nearly lost: its humanity. One warm summer evening, Daniel sat alone on the porch as the setting sun painted the sky with soft shades of orange and purple. The American flag fluttered gently above him. The familiar rocking chair beside his remained empty, yet somehow no longer felt lonely. He looked toward Aliner's roses blooming beautifully beneath the windows. He thought about the long journey. The notices. The fines. The uncertainty. The unexpected kindness of strangers. The courage of neighbors. The determination of his granddaughter. The loyalty of fellow veterans. The honesty of one board member who chose conscience over comfort. Justice had not arrived overnight. It had required patience, truth, integrity, and ordinary people willing to stand together. Across the street, Noah carefully raised his own small American flag outside his family's home. He stood straight, placed his hand over his heart, then smiled proudly toward Daniel. The old Marine returned the smile. Not because he believed the world had become perfect. It never would. But because one child had learned that respect could not be measured by property values. That courage often begins with kindness. And that the strongest communities are built not on fear of rules, but on love, fairness, sacrifice, and the willingness to protect one another. As twilight settled over Willow Creek Lane, the flags continued to wave together in the gentle evening breeze. One belonged to an old veteran. The other belonged to a young boy who had witnessed what real honor looked like. The distance between them was only a few houses. The lesson connecting them would last a lifetime.